Well, there's no question that Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, as Hamas calls it, changed the nature of the terrorism threat in the West. We saw in the immediate aftermath of the attack that Al-Qaeda's, various affiliates and branches, they immediately heaped praise on Hamas. We saw this, with Al-Shabaab. We saw this with out of the Indian subcontinent. I think Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. They all were basically cheering on Hamas, and this is kind of interesting because historically Hamas has not been part of, the global jihad. Hamas's targeting has been limited to Israel, and there are important ideological differences between Hamas and Al Qaeda and ISIS. And in fact, Hamas, has actually persecuted and prosecuted jihadi groups in Gaza. Hamas subscribes to nationalism and participated in the democratic processes in 2006, which is anathema to Al Qaeda and to Islamic State. And yet, Hamas wounded Israel. And so, what all of these groups share is anti Zionism, anti Semitism, and they are anti Israel. And so, they have been very complimentary of Hamas. But even more than that, the Hamas attack actually re energized these groups. So, according to the FBI, we've seen more Al Qaeda chatter and more specific and numerous and vocal Al Qaeda threats against the West than we had seen over the past 5 years. ISIS is also increasingly making noise. And more, the nature of their threats are against Jewish targets. And so that seems also to have been influenced by Hamas. On top of that, we're seeing evidence of Hamas's presence internationally and not just in the Levant. There was a operation, according to numerous papers, as well as the intelligence services out of Germany and the Netherlands, that there were Hamas operatives there working at the behest of the Hamas leadership out of Lebanon. And even more broadly, you see at these demonstrations, part of the global intifada, whether you're talking about inside of the United States or in Canada or in Western Europe, it's not uncommon to see a Hamas flag, as well as, frankly, flags of other concerning groups like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, even a Hezbollah flag at one of the events out of Chicago. Now, these are all U.S. designated foreign terrorist organizations. And, so we are seeing signs that they have an international presence. And this is concerning to the U.S. intel services. There's no question that the Hamas attack undermined the widespread Israeli perception, that it's, amazingly good at intelligence and that, its counterterrorism is impeccable. What happened on October 7th was really shocking and was really damning when it comes to Israeli counterterrorism. You had over 1,000 Hamas operatives, plus a lot of additional Gazans who came over the border, and that snuck up on Netanyahu. They were unprepared for it. There is some evidence that lower level, people working for the security state inside of Israel were concerned of an attack, but apparently not enough to move the prime minister. And once inside of Israel, the terrorists were able to wander around killing Israelis with impunity for hours. So this was very shocking. And so this presents a big problem for Israel because, to a large extent, Israeli security is dependent on deterrence, essentially dissuading potential terrorist adversaries not to attack in the first place because they'll be unsuccessful or the price for doing so will be, astronomical and won't be worth their while. And so I actually think that this is one of the reasons why Israel has responded so forcefully in Gaza, in order to convey that if there is a terrorist attack of any magnitude, the consequences to the group and maybe even to the population will be, quite sizable. But there's no question, based on what happened on October 7th, that Israel does face very real terrorist insecurities, and that this is true even despite the very strong U.S.-Israeli relationship. I think that in the aftermath of that terrorist attack, U.S. support for Israel under the Biden administration has been surprisingly strong. Don't forget that the Biden administration and the Netanyahu government have historically not gotten along at all. Netanyahu and Biden have a testy personal relationship. And within the Democratic Party in the United States, a significant portion is actually quite critical of Israel and the U.S.-Israeli relationship. Specifically, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party has been advocating very fiercely for the United States to make any support of Israel conditional on all sorts of reforms, especially in terms of Israel ending, the so-called occupation, joining the peace process, ending the military campaign in Gaza, etc. And yet the Biden administration has not followed that, political pressure. Instead, it has supplied a large amount of weapons to Israel. It has defended Israel publicly, including in the UN. And the US under Biden even moved military assets, naval assets, into the Eastern Mediterranean in order to dissuade Hezbollah from attacking. And this has surprised Hamas. I've seen a statement by the Hamas leadership saying that they were surprised by the extent of U.S. support under Biden for Hamas. I do think that moving forward, that relationship increasingly is going to be put under pressure. It's not uncommon to see major demonstrations by the Democrats, by the progressive wing, screaming at President Biden, calling him Genocide Joe. And I have to believe that that sort of domestic pressure, especially with the presidential election coming up, is going to force Biden to put pressure on Netanyahu to make some substantial changes with respect to the war in Gaza. Whether Netanyahu listens is another story. Well, everybody wants to believe in the two-state solution. The two-state solution seems to make a lot of sense to people because, the basic idea is that the Palestinians are rising up because they just want a state. And so if only Israel ends its occupation, it gets out of the West Bank, or at least the vast majority of it, it ends almost all of the settlements, if not all of them, it gets out of Gaza, that this will essentially placate the Palestinians. However, although I myself would like to see a two-state solution, I'm not a religious person, I'm not in any way ideologically wedded to the idea of Judea and Samaria, etc. I don't actually think that a two-state solution is likely to happen. I've been following the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for a long time. And if you look at the so-called final status issues, which derailed the Oslo peace process in the 1990s and even afterwards, the future borders of a Palestinian state, the settlements, the status of Jerusalem, the so-called right of return in terms of Palestinian refugees. Those are intractable problems, and time has not made them easier to resolve. So I don't think that a two-state solution is any easier to come about now than it was in previous attempts, all of which failed. And part of the reason has to do with the nature of the Israeli government and the Israeli population, which has actually moved to the political right since the early 1990s. And the Palestinian leadership, certainly if you look at Hamas, they are not interested in a two-state solution, contrary to what some people might say. The Palestinian Authority is extraordinarily weak, and they're not seen as a viable partner for peace among the vast majority of Israelis. And so at a strictly pragmatic level, I just don't see a two-state solution happening, even though so many of us in the international community, would like it to happen and have wanted it to happen for many, many years. The Israeli public is not interested in the aftermath of the largest, slaughtering of Jews since the Holocaust, of a two-state solution. There is less support for a two-state solution in Israel now, I would say. Even if Netanyahu is replaced, his replacements are not going to push a two-state solution. What Israel wants to do is it wants to maintain its very favorable relations with the United States, as well as those with Saudi Arabia, and to even improve on Israeli relations with Saudi Arabia, to have the Saudis become party to the Abraham Accords, all completely independently of any progress on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that will be difficult for the Saudi leadership to do, given the anger within the Arab world towards Israel and their longstanding demand for there to be a Palestinian state. But there's no question that Netanyahu wants to treat these issues as separate: the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Israeli relations with the United States and Saudi Arabia, which Israel hopes will move forward.